Hello and welcome to our two-part webinar series on the new Revenues and Welfare Benefits Apprenticeship Standard. My name's Neil Albert, I work for Escalla and I'll be your host today. I'm pleased to say that our speaker today is Julie Maycock, who is the lead officer on the employer-led Apprenticeship Standard Group. So in today's webinar, we'll be introducing the new standard, what it looks like, how it will be assessed, and how it will be delivered. And in the second webinar next week, we'll be taking a closer look at the rules and funding around this apprenticeship. So before we begin, I'd just like to discuss some housekeeping rules. So if you look at the slide in front of you, most of this is self-explanatory, but there are a few points that I'd like to make. So firstly, we'll be taking some questions at the end of the session. So if you've got any questions at all throughout this webinar, please just type them into the chat panel on the side of your screen. Secondly, there will be a couple of polls during this webinar. Please get involved in the polls. We won't publish any of your individual responses, but we will let you know the overall results. And finally, we issued webinar workbooks to all attendees. However, if you didn't receive one for any reason, then you can download a copy of the webinar workbook from the panel on the side of your screen. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm joined today by Julie Maycock. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you, Neil.
Julie, can you give our listeners a bit of a background into your current role, and maybe tell them what you do and how you became involved in this apprenticeship?
Okay, thank you. Well, I've been in revenues and benefits for the last 28 years, starting out at Cherwell District Council, on to West Oxfordshire, and more recently working for Cambridge City Council. As far as I'm concerned, my role in this particular Trailblazer group is I'm chair of the group. That means that I am responsible for organising meetings, workshops, leading those meetings, communicating back any feedback from those meetings. I am the person that liaises with the Institute for Apprenticeships, and ultimately the person that submits the standard to the Institute for approval.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Julie. For anybody who doesn't know Escalla, and anyone where we've not worked with you before, we're a training company. We're also an Ofsted Grade 2 apprenticeship provider. We deliver legislation training, so a lot of you use our kind of revenues and benefits legislation training services. We also deliver personal development courses, digital skills and Office 365 training and support. We deliver e-learning, training course materials to download, and we also deliver fast-track recruitment programs. So before we go through the agenda, we're going to first start with our first poll of the afternoon. So the poll question is, who are you most likely to put through this new level 4 standard? Will it be new recruits, staff in post for less than a year, staff in post for more than a year, or kind of a mixture of all three? So please bear in mind that this is now a level 4 apprenticeship. So if you'd like to cast your votes now. Okay, just a couple of seconds to go. Okay, so we're going to give you the results now. Okay, there you go. Thanks very much. Okay, Julie, if you'd like to just take us through the agenda then.
Okay, just short thing. I'm very interested in those results, actually. Kind of what I expected to see. I'm really pleased to see a good split between new apprentices or new staff and existing staff. So that is really good news as far as the Trailblazer Group are concerned. Okay, so the agenda for today. I'm going to go through why we developed a new standard. We're going to talk about how apprenticeships have changed, and specifically over the last couple of years. I'm going to tell you how we developed the new standard, how it will be assessed, and what the apprenticeship journey looks like. And then Neil, you're going to talk us through, aren't you, how Escalla plan to deliver the apprenticeship?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so why did we develop a new standard? Well, I'll be honest, Neil, a question I've asked myself on numerous occasions on this journey. It has been quite challenging, I have to say. But quite simply, we didn't have one. I think as a group, as a Trailblazer group, we saw apprenticeships as a positive to driving up standards and quality of work that we do in revenues and benefits. We feel, and I think this is how it's supposed to be, apprenticeship is a job with training to meet industry standards. And I hope that you will all think that that's what we've created. As a group, we felt it was important to devise something not only attractive to encourage new people into our organisation, but something that existing staff can also undertake in order to develop them and their full potential, and therefore be more of a benefit to the organisation that we work for. And the poll that you've just taken answers that question and is what we hoped for. So whilst we don't want to lose our staff, the standard is designed to provide the apprentice with transferable skills so that they can perhaps move from a different posts within the organisation, or obviously move to various posts outside the organisation. Lots of organisations in the past, including some of the authorities I worked with, have taken apprentices, but not, because we didn't have a specific revenues and benefits apprenticeship, they were linked to things like customer services and business admin qualifications. And we didn't feel that these were necessarily appropriate to meet the specific and niche areas for our particular vocation. So another reason for us joining this group and creating a new standard. And of course, we want to take advantage of the levy funding. Unfortunately, levy funding can only be utilised on apprenticeship training. We hope that the levy will cover a significant amount of cost for the training, but unfortunately it doesn't cover the wages of the apprenticeship. So just kind of to put that into a very interesting perspective from somebody that's been on the group. So I had an email from a director at one of the district councils that has been on the group, and he, and I quote, sent me an email saying, "I've been following the progress of the group very closely. I think it's very important to re-professionalise this area after many years of cuts, customer service scripts and general neglect." An interesting perspective.
Definitely. Julie, just on that last point, why do you think it's important to have a new standard specifically for revenues and benefits? And why do you and the rest of the group feel it's important to continue investing with universal credit just around the corner?
Okay, so there are approximately 20 to 30,000 people working in revenues and benefits. So quite clearly it's a profession of its own. Universal credit around the corner, Neil? Yeah. Really? In the last few years, if the last few years are anything to go by, there's still a bit of a mountain to climb. We still have a job. We still have a job to do now. We still have a job in the future. That job needs to be done by highly effective staff, certainly with our reduced budgets. And that means, I feel, investing in training. We need to replace staff we lose with fully competent officers, and this is a really good way of doing that. And I think it's fair to say that a number of our organisations do have an ageing workforce, so this is a fantastic way to deal with succession planning and making sure we've got the skills for the future. Just interestingly, in a recent meeting with software suppliers, the DWP said there is still at least 3 to 4 years of big changes for us in benefits. So I think still work to be done. And when it does finally happen, well, we've still got supported accommodation, that's a definite. We've at the moment still got pensioners, in the short term there's nowhere for those to go. We've got council tax support, council tax reduction, we still have DHP, and of course we have council tax and business rates.
Yeah, really good points. I mean, I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago in London. I know you were there as well, Julie. And there was a representative from the DWP there. And she said if she had one message for CEOs at local authorities, it would be that it's definitely not time to close down their housing benefit departments. And she said far from it. She was kind of basically saying exactly what you're saying there, that there's still so much work to be done. So I think that's a really important message. And for us, I think we felt it was really good to hear the DWP kind of say that, because I hadn't really heard that admission from them. And certainly I've heard her talk before as well, the representative. So that was interesting.
Great thing to hear. I think we're all concerned about losing staff quicker than we need to. Okay. So how have apprenticeships changed? So certainly apprenticeships have changed in the last 2 years, and we've gone away from what you will know as the modern apprenticeship, and standards have replaced frameworks. Frameworks were developed by sector bodies. They were mainly qualification focused, so therefore they were linked to things like vocational qualifications, MVQ type qualifications. And apprentices' aim was to gain those qualifications as they progressed, gaining their knowledge and skills as they went. But these knowledge and skills weren't necessarily tested at the end of the apprenticeship. They were registered and were tested on those things during the apprenticeship, but there was no real end point to make sure that they had got the skills required in order to go off and do the job. And I think what that did was that meant that employers then were required to do further training with those apprentices to be able to use them in the workplace. Standards then, I think, are very different. They're developed by employer-led groups. It's deemed to be a qualification in itself. I feel that the standards are much clearer, more concise, and I think they follow a pathway of high quality knowledge, skills and behaviours, things that we require for the job that our apprentices are doing. I think the fact as well that the standard's been devised by employers means that the programme delivers what we need as an employee. Endpoint assessment designed to test and measure the knowledge, skills and behaviours, and this is carried out before that we can sign them off on the apprenticeship. And of course funding, well, it's promoted as a much simpler and streamlined process. I'm not sure that employers feel that that's necessarily the case, but I think it is very clear on what funding we have available to us.
Okay, Julie, well, just picking up on the funding issue, do you mind just going through, very briefly going through the levy funding, just in case anybody who's listening isn't aware how it works?
Okay, well, I mean, Neil, I'm no way an expert on the funding side of things and the levy, but I do have some basic knowledge of what that entails. So the way the levy works is that employers who pay more than £3 million in wages per annum have been subject to the apprenticeship levy, and that started last April 2017. And the amount of levy that employers have to pay is 0.5% of their wage bill. Levy payers can use these funds, to which government actually add an extra 10% to spend on apprenticeship training, but it has to be apprenticeship training. It can't be used for other training to develop skills of our employees. So this amount of money has to be used on apprenticeships. So just to give you an example, where I work, Cambridge City Council, the authority that's been backing this qualification or this standard, has a salary bill last year of around £23 million. That means that they would pay an annual levy of £115,000, so not a small amount as obviously that shows. So those funds are held in a digital account, and central government will increase that figure by 10%. But it doesn't mean that if we don't spend it, that we can keep it. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So anything that's not spent goes back into central government funds and is used to help the non-levy paying organisations to fund their apprenticeships. So out of that fund, then the employer pays the training provider, whoever that might be. This is the amount of money paid to that training provider is capped. It's capped by a funding band, which is something that will be allocated to our revenues and benefits apprenticeship. And quite simply, you can't pay the training provider more than the highest level of that particular funding band. So, for example, if the training costs us £12,000, so if we employ a training provider and it costs us £12,000 to train a new apprentice, and the funding band for Revs and Ben's welfare practitioner is set at £10,000, then employers can only draw on £10,000 from that digital account. The rest of it they would have to fund from other measures.
So like existing training budget, for example.
Training, yeah, if we still have them.
That's true. Okay, just so everyone's aware, we're going to be discussing the rules and the levy and levy funding in our next webinar, which is taking place next Thursday, the 10th of May. And we'll be having our in-house apprenticeship expert who'll be talking to us then. I'll be going through that.
Okay, so just to kind of highlight again some of the changes that we've just talked about. The standard, what's different from the old framework, it's not qualification driven. It is a qualification in itself. And we focus more on knowledge, skills and behaviours. So the attributes that we require from our staff to do their job effectively. The standard is quite short and concise. It's not too wordy. It's not overcomplicated. Interestingly, when as a Trailblazer group you go in to prepare a standard for submission, you're limited to 2 sides of A4. So there's quite a constraint really on making sure that you've got the correct knowledge, skills and behaviours, because you've only got 2 sides of A4 to actually use up those areas. I think when you look at the standard, and hopefully you'll all have access to the standard within your packs, it shows really typical descriptions of revenues and benefits jobs requirements. It also will help the apprenticeship and give them a really good understanding of what area of work they're going into, especially if you're it's a new apprentice that you're employing. Then we've got the endpoint assessment. Now, the endpoint assessment is really pivotal to the apprenticeship. So you've got your learning and development through the 12 to 18 months, but it's the endpoint assessment that's truly going to check that that apprenticeship is ready to go in as a fully fledged worker. So the endpoint assessment ensures that the apprentice meets all of the knowledge, skills and behaviours within the standard. It ensures that they can meet those at the end of the apprenticeship, as well as, of course, the testing that will go on during the training. The apprenticeship was meant to be stretching and it is graded, and I'll talk a little bit more about the grading when we look at the endpoint assessment. But it is recognised to, it is devised rather to recognise those apprentices who excel in their apprenticeship.
Okay, thanks.
And as far as, sorry, it's okay. And as far as the professional alignment to professional registration is concerned, well, the Institute of Revenue's rating valuation have been involved in this process right from the start. My understanding is that they are currently discussing back at the Institute whether to link apprenticeships to professional membership of the IRRV.
Okay, Judy. Sorry, I was going to say, how does this slide relate to the new apprenticeship standard? And does the standard carry with it an external qualification?
Okay, well, right from the start, I mean, it was something we considered, but right from the start, the Department for Education, who are now the Institute for Apprenticeships, actively discourage linking a Trailblazer apprenticeship to a qualification unless it's something that you specifically must have in order to fulfill your job role. So, as I say, actively discouraged. So they tend not to link qualifications. And if you get the opportunity to go into the Institute for Apprenticeship website and look at any of the apprenticeship standards on there, and there are quite a number now, you will see very, very few where they are actually linked to another recognised qualification. Quite simply, the apprenticeship is a recognised qualification in its own right.
Okay, thank you, Julie.
Okay, so just a little bit of background as to how the new standards was developed. As you can see from the PowerPoint slide in front of you, the employer group bid to become a Trailblazer and to be able to develop a new standard. And the first part of that gateway is to actually get approval to do that. Now, myself and Mike Cahill, who works for East Sussex County Council, have for a number of years been involved in delivering MVQs. And that's aside from our day job. Okay. And we're both really committed to learning and development. So early discussions between us started towards the end of 2016, and then having approached my manager, Alison Cole, and getting approval from Cambridge for me to lead this challenge, I contacted another colleague of mine from Oxford City, and quite simply it went from there. How I must just kind of put in yet another historic Oxford and Cambridge event, hopefully. Okay. So in order to see what kind of whether people out there wanted to go ahead with an apprenticeship for revs and bends, we used the IRRV and also SIPFA to communicate to all its members about the Trailblazer group and whether people wanted to join that group. Also, Escalla had received quite a lot of inquiries actually about whether there was apprenticeships, and you also encouraged your customers to join our group, which was really very useful. Both also yourselves, Escalla, and the Institute Revenues Rating Evaluation joined us on that Trailblazer group in your role as training providers to provide us with your expertise in that particular role. That group was established probably just over 12 months ago now. Yeah, about 12 months ago, I think March 2017. So initially we worked with who were the Department for Education in putting forward an expression of interest. That in itself was quite a challenge. We started the process around March, April time. We were allocated a relationship manager, so that was somebody that worked for the Department for Education who worked with us to guide us through the process. I have to say, initially we felt quite discouraged. We were continuously invited to explore other groups, and particularly the Department for Education were keen for us to join up with the HMRC because they already had an apprenticeship that already existed. But we felt very strongly and we continued in our approach that we felt that we had a big enough response to this possible apprenticeship that we wanted something more specific to suit our profession. And as I've said earlier, 20 to 30,000 revs and bends professionals throughout the UK makes it worthwhile certainly going ahead with. So we finally got this is just the expression of interest. So the fact that we could even get, permission to go ahead and look at a standard, that was finally accepted in August after we had, shown that that it wasn't worth local authorities teaming up with HMRC with their standard which already existed. So from then, we then obviously start started creating the standard, and the group kept in regular contact. We held workshops to devise and discuss what we wanted in the standards. Those standards were then issued out via the IRRV and SIPFA for consultation from other interested organisations across the UK. And we were finally given the go-ahead to submit our standard in early January. So a lot of work went on between September and January in order to get the standard as you can now see it on the Institute for Apprenticeships. That standard was submitted in early January and was approved in March of this year. So since then, we've submitted a suggested training plan along with quotes from training providers. And that's to aid the funding approval process. So the funding approval to be allocated a funding band. That's now been submitted as the endpoint assessment plan, which is a really big piece of work. And that was submitted on the 11th of April. So kind of during the last 12 months, we've overcome a number of obstacles. We've persevered with a challenging process where we've been allocated at least 3 different relationship managers within that time.
Ridiculous.
Absolutely. We've overcome the changes because the process to submit a standard has changed twice during that period of time. And the biggest kind of change in that was the Department for Education handing over responsibility of apprenticeships to the newly formed Institute for Apprenticeships, which was probably about 6 months ago.
Okay. Julie, kind of just looking kind of ahead, who will be responsible for maintaining the standards moving forward? I mean, is it going to be the employer-led group? Are they going to continue to meet? If they are going to continue to meet, is there any opportunity for any other local authorities to get involved if they're not already?
Yeah, okay. Well, once the standard is out there and can be used, and we hope that will be sometime soon, the standard must be reviewed within a period of 3 years. Okay. I think it's important during that time that as a trailblazer group, we continue to meet and communicate, especially when, you know, organisations start taking on apprenticeships and start using the standard. I mean, you know, most of us in the group, well, I don't think any of us in the group have ever done anything like this before, and I am sure it will be necessary to make some changes in the future. So anybody out there, any organisation with an interest is really encouraged to join the group and provide ongoing suggestions and feedback to the current standard so that we can make it better going forward.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, on just before we go through this slide, for any of you who have got your webinar workbook to hand, there is a list of the exact standards in there. And once again, if you weren't sent or for whatever reason didn't receive your webinar workbook, you can download a copy of it from the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Okay, Julie. Okay,
thank you. So the new standard then, the new standard is made up of knowledge, skills and behaviours. The standard is set at a level 4. The reason we went for a level 4 was because we based it on existing Ofqual's knowledge and skills descriptors, and we tried to find the level which best matched exactly what it was we were trying to achieve with this apprenticeship, and bearing in mind, you know, the very level that our officers work to. So it is set at a level 4. So the standard, hopefully, that you can see in front of you, sets out the knowledge, skills and behaviours that the apprentice needs to gain during their 12 to 18-month apprenticeship. And just if I can just go through one example, if you have a look at your standards, hopefully, as I say, you have those on your screen or in front of you. One of the knowledge standards, I think, is you know, something that we're all expected to know is legislation, policies and procedures. And what's required is that the apprenticeship gains a practical and technical knowledge of the relevant legislation to ensure accuracy and legality of actions taken. And then it goes on to include some of the relevant legislation that we use in our job roles on a day-to-day basis. What you don't see there is any reference to the Housing Benefit General Regulations and also the Council Tax Admin and Enforcement Regulations. Those things will fit under current regulations. The reason they're not there is, one, to allow you to use which pathway you want your apprentice to move down, whether you want them to be more housing benefit based or council tax based. But also we wanted to make sure that the standards were age proof.
Okay.
We didn't want to put too many specific pieces of legislation in there. For example, we didn't want to put any DHP type legislation or even universal credit, because we just don't know when and if these might change. So by using current regulations, that very much means that we use whatever regulations are applicable at the time.
Good point. Good idea.
Absolutely. Okay. So with those knowledge, skills and behaviours, the apprenticeship is trained with a combination of off-the-job and on-the-job training to meet all the knowledge and skills and behaviours over their 12 to 18-month apprenticeship period. So it's up to the employer. They'll either deliver the training themselves, or I think in most cases will contract a training provider to do this for them. Either way, it's important to know that if, as an employer or a training provider, you must be on the approved provider on the register of apprenticeship training providers. There is quite an arduous process to go through to ensure that you are at a level where you have the skills to be able to train an apprentice. So the training provider or employer or jointly will work with the apprentice over the 12-month period, ensuring that all the standards are met competently and consistently, so making sure that they're met over the whole period of time. After this period of time, they will then, or the employer will decide when the apprentice is ready to go through the endpoint assessment to complete their apprenticeship.
Okay, Julie, I just want to pick up a point here and just say, does everyone have to satisfy the same criteria? So is there an opportunity to specialise in a certain discipline, and how does this work?
Yep, so we were really very careful in how we put together knowledge and skills and behaviours. So everybody has to satisfy the same standard, but as I've just kind of pointed out, really, those standards are written as generically as we possibly could, not to make it not worthwhile doing, but written as generically as we can, so that employers can decide whether they want their apprentices to go down a council tax, a benefits, a business rate route, or a combination of all three. So even though they will be expected to have some knowledge of the other job role area, they can actually do their apprenticeship on a chosen job area.
Okay, thank you.
So the last kind of bit in the process is the endpoint assessment, and the endpoint assessment is the bit really where we're testing that the training has been relevant to the apprentice throughout the 12 to 18-month period beforehand. So the employer and training provider will discuss and agree when they think the apprentice is ready for the endpoint assessment, with the final decision being down to the employer. They're the ones with the apprentice in their department, so they'll make a decision when they think they're ready to do the endpoint assessment. In order to meet the endpoint assessment, in order to go forward to the endpoint assessment, they do have to meet the gateway conditions, and that is that they've been able to demonstrate those knowledge, skills and behaviours throughout their apprenticeship period. The other thing that they must have is the apprentice must be have academic qualifications to a level 2 functional skills in maths and English. So if we have any apprentices within our organisation that don't have, for example, GCSEs or the old O-levels in my day, that during that 12-18 month training period, they will also have to do maths and English at functional skills level 2. So that has to be built into their training plan. The endpoint assessment has to be conducted by an organisation that's independent from the employer and the training provider for obvious reasons. You know, this does ensure complete impartiality in whether apprenticeship passes their apprenticeship or not. And again, they need to be on a register. They need to be on the register for endpoint assessment organisations. Another really rigorous process to ensure that that organisation is fit for purpose. The endpoint assessment, again, I think that's provided to you as a separate document, but the endpoint assessment is around 15 pages long. Again, we were given guidance that it shouldn't be any longer than 15 pages and that most are set at 15 pages, but it sets out exactly what the apprentice needs to do to satisfy the endpoint assessment. So in the endpoint assessment, so just very briefly, there are 3 assessment methods to test competency. The first assessment method is through presentation and question and answer on real cases that the apprentice has dealt with. The second one is a project assignment, which again tests their key knowledge and skills. The assignment will be around the appeal or tribunal process. They don't have to actually take a case to appeal or tribunal, but they do have to understand the process. And lastly, and certainly not least, a professional discussion, and that will help pick up on some of the behavioural areas of the endpoint assessment. And as you can see to the right hand side, for each assessment method, the apprentice will either be fail or pass, and then one or two areas have distinctions also. This endpoint assessment being 15 pages long, I think was our biggest challenge through putting together Revs and Ben's apprenticeship.
Julie, what happens to a learner if they don't pass all 3 criteria first time around?
Okay, so in the endpoint assessment, we have to be quite clear on what the process is should that happen. So if the apprentice fails one of the assessment methods or 3, hopefully that won't be the case, because between the employer and the training provider, we shouldn't be putting an apprentice forward for the endpoint assessment if they're not ready. But if, you know, things happen and if they do fail the assessment, then they need to resit it. And it'll be down to the employer and possibly talking to the apprentice and the training provider to decide whether that apprentice actually needs more training, or whether there was just a bit of a blip in that assessment method and they're ready to do a resit, say in a couple of weeks' time. The important thing to point out here, though, that if the apprentice has to resit, they can't get a distinction in their apprenticeship. They can pass, but they can't get a distinction unless there are really exceptional circumstances as to why they didn't pass one of those assessment methods in the first place.
Okay.
So this does go on to a bit of a recap on what we've talked about today and where we are with the apprenticeship journey. So the apprentice starts out and undertakes a rigorous training plan around 12 to 18 months to cover all the knowledge, skills and behaviours of the standard. They will then also have to do functional skills during that period if they haven't got the relevant qualifications. And then once they're ready to go to the gateway, they can go and be submitted towards the endpoint assessment. That means that they will collate and submit some evidence of cases that they've dealt with, or get some cases ready to submit to their endpoint assessment, and then that endpoint assessment will be checked, and the endpoint assessor will give their guidance on whether the apprentice has passed or not. So just to kind of, recap on where we've been, the process has been quite challenging, more challenging, I think, than anything any of us expected. That's a good thing. In some respects, it shows that the process is really robust. However, it has been frustrating at times. The goalposts have moved more times than I care to mention, but I think we're finally on the home straight. So from a Trailblazer group perspective, we've done what we need to do for now. Of course, it's work in progress. We will want to relook at the standards for future, and we may have to address some feedback from the endpoint assessment that's currently been submitted, but we don't expect this to be too onerous.
Okay, brilliant. Just looking at point 1, is there any application process or criteria that comes before this? So, for example, do apprentices need to have a certain level of experience or qualification?
No, they don't. No, we really didn't want to be as prescriptive as that. So we wanted the apprenticeship to be available for brand new staff. It was a fantastic way of going through a really rigorous training plan. We equally didn't want to discourage existing staff, especially around areas of having relevant qualifications in order to be admitted through the apprenticeship process. We will have plenty of staff within our organisations that maybe don't have recognised qualifications, and we didn't want to be as prescriptive so that they couldn't join the apprenticeship programme.
Okay, so you didn't want to exclude them. Okay.
Didn't want to exclude them, no.
Okay, so how will this apprenticeship be delivered? Well, so just to say that Escalla has already developed 3 training plans for this new apprenticeship standard. The 3 separate training paths are, well, there's one which is a revenues and benefits path for new starters. Then there's a benefits path for existing staff. And then there's a revenues path for existing staff. So the training will be delivered in a blended approach. So there will certainly be classroom-based sessions, which will be for definitely for legislation and for systems training, and this will be backed up by e-learning and also trainer support. The apprenticeship training will be delivered in regional cohorts of at least 10 learners, and we'll be looking to collaborate with local authorities on that. Just at the bottom of the slide there, you'll see it says 20% off the job learning. So Julie, do you mind elaborating a bit on that and just tell us a little bit about what that means for 20% off the job learning?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, this is really fundamental to the apprenticeship, and Institute for Apprenticeships at the moment are quite specific that 20% of the training for our apprentice must be off the job learning. Having said that, there is a lot of stuff in the press at the moment where I think in the future this might be looked at. But for now, this is what we have as part of the apprenticeship. So 20% off the job learning can be so many different things, and they're not necessarily, taking the apprentice away from the workplace and them being in classroom-based type training. It can be e-learning, it can be job shadowing, it can be being mentored. It might be a research project that they're doing within the office. They might be doing workbooks, they take study time, they could be attending conferences or being put on projects, and just attending webinars really. So that's just a few of the things, just touching on some of the things, but those would be included as off the job learning.
Okay, thank you, because I know that's definitely one of the questions I've been asked by a lot of my customers.
I think it's a concern, isn't it? Because organisations are concerned about the amount of time that the apprentice is going to be away from the office, but that off the job learning, it is really fundamental to their apprenticeship. But of course it can only help with staff development as well. So
I agree. Okay, so why should you work with Escalla? Well, in order to draw funding from your Levy digital account, you need to use a provider that is on the register of approved training providers. I know Julie's already mentioned this earlier. And just to say, Escalla is on the register. However, if you do look at the register, please note we are listed under our legal entity name, which is Training Synergy. So Escalla is our training name, our trading name. We've been delivering apprenticeships in digital marketing and IT for over 7 years. And we've also previously delivered the Level 3 certificate in benefits and local taxation. We are a very experienced training provider. We've been providing revenues and benefits training for over 20 years. And the majority of our local authority team all has a revenues and benefits background. The next point I want to make is extremely important. Many local authorities have a procurement policy in place which mandates that you have to use a training provider that has a Grade 2 Ofsted report. I'm pleased to say Escalla has recently received this grade, and based on our achievement rate of 91.3% this year, if we were reassessed now, we would potentially achieve an outstanding grade. We also manage our apprenticeship delivery in-house, and we have a direct contract with the skills funding agency, so we don't subcontract this work to a third party. We can also help you to recruit staff through our fast track programme if there's a need, and if you'd like to see any case studies around fast tracks that we've delivered to local authorities, then please get in touch with us, and we will be able to provide this for you. Okay, so before we take some of your questions, we'll now do our second poll of the afternoon. So this poll question is, now that you know more about the standard, how likely are you to opt for this specific standard rather than a generic alternative such as an apprenticeship in customer services? So if you'd like to cast your vote now, please. Okay, and closing that. Okay, so Julie, what's your thoughts on that one there? It looks like we've got about 40% likely to use this standard over generic, 33 very likely to use this standard. 23% of you undecided. Yeah, that's actually quite positive. Actually, I have to say.
I think that's quite positive. I can totally see there will be organisations out there that are undecided. It's a new apprenticeship. Maybe they're waiting to see how this works in other organisations. Great to see that 73% of organisations out there are saying they're either likely or very likely to use this standard. I think apprenticeships are huge on the agenda for central government at the moment, and they have put a lot of effort into ensuring that employers do have a say in what they want from an apprenticeship. It's now down to us to use it.
Okay, so we'll take some questions. So please, if you've got any questions, please do ask them. But before we do, I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to ask you, Julie. So first of all, can you give us a brief update on the current position with the apprenticeship?
Okay, well, where we are at the moment, so the standard has been approved and it is available on the Institute for Apprenticeships website for anybody to see. So that's showing that the standard's been approved. So there's nothing we can do to change the what's in that standard now. The next two things that we're waiting for is initially we were waiting for an indicative funding band. This was supposed to be provided to us at the end of March, but I think I explained earlier that the processes keep changing, and so the Institute for Apprenticeships has decided they're not going to give us that information yet.
Right, so there isn't any up-to-date news on the funding?
No up-to-date news on an indicative funding band. But what I can say is that the endpoint assessment plan was submitted on the 11th of April. There's a 6-week cycle for everything in the Institute for Apprenticeships. So now we're in the position position that 6 weeks from the 11th of April, that takes us towards the end of May, we should be provided with feedback on the endpoint assessment, i.e. is it accepted or not, or is there further work we need to do on it? And now I'm expecting to receive the funding band at that particular point. All being well, and there's not much work to do on the endpoint assessment, then those things will then go forward to ministers. And I'm really rather hoping that they get to ministers before they recess for the summer holidays. So having spoken to the relationship manager, if all goes well, she thinks that we may know about our apprenticeship by July and at the latest August, unless there is a real problem with the endpoint assessment plan.
So that's basically, so worst case scenario is, and best case scenario is, really, from your gut feeling, I guess. It's so hard to say, isn't it?
It's really
You've kind
hard.
of been here before.
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I have to say the relationship manager that we've worked with, the third relationship manager that we've worked with at the Institute for Apprenticeships, has a HMRC type background and has been really, really supportive in this process. The endpoint assessment has gone backwards and forwards to her on so many occasions as new standards and EPAs were going through. So she's had the very latest feedback from other relationship managers about what's going to be accepted and what's not. So we feel like we've probably done most of the work on the EPA. I can't say that we won't get some feedback and have to amend some areas of the endpoint assessment. I feel quietly confident that we can get this through for July.
Brilliant. Let's hope so.
Hope so too.
Julie, we've got a question here which was asked to us by Manchester City Council. So they want to know, where would customer services staff fit into the new standard?
Okay, well, I think if you look at the standards, the knowledge, skills and behaviours, this certainly will fit in with those customer services staff that are specifically dealing with housing benefit, council tax support, council tax and business rates. On the group, we had people that were just dealing with providing advice to customers. There is some scope in here where the apprentice will have to actually do some back office work, but surely that's a really good thing for customer service staff to see what goes through as the end product. So absolutely, this fits for customer services staff too, that want to get an apprenticeship in this particular area of expertise.
Okay, so we've got a question here, which is the training provided centrally or locally?
Okay, well, I think probably that might be a question for you.
Yeah, I know it is. So the training will be provided. So how we're going to be doing this, we will be working with local authorities in cohorts of at least 10 learners. So it means that training will be provided locally, where it's classroom-based training. So our trainers will be coming out to that regional cohort. And there'll also be, so we won't be delivering classroom-based training locally. So, for example, we won't be delivering that in London. If you're not based in London, we won't be expecting you to come to us. But certainly, there will also be, as I said earlier on, e-learning. And so e-learning, learners will be sort of learning themselves locally on the e-learning. So hopefully that answers that one. Are the assessors industry qualified professionals? That's one for you, Julie, I think.
Okay, so I think you're referring to the endpoint assessment organisations. Yeah. Yes, to be a registered endpoint assessment organisation, you have to register for the specific apprenticeship that you want to be an endpoint assessment organisation for. That means you have to be occupationally competent. So the answer to that is yes.
Okay, thank you, Julie. We've had a question which says, how many regions are there for cohorts? Well, the answer is at the moment, we don't know. So as we start to work with you, so these will be conversations we'll be having with all of our customers. And as we do have those conversations with you, we'll start to get an idea for you know where people are looking to put this through, and whether they want to work in cohorts with neighbouring authorities. So it'll have to be kind of within a region where people can get to kind of a central point that's near them. We've got a question here about, can we see the course content? Certainly we've got the like I said earlier on, we've got the three lesson plans, the one for the new starters, revs and bends, the one, and then the two for the existing starters, existing staff rather, the revenues one and the benefits one. Yes, we've certainly got those, and we will be able to provide those for you. Okay, yeah, this one here says, will you be able, so I've got a question, will you be able to help authorities to form a cohort? Yes, we can. We're very, I think as I said earlier on, we're very happy to come and visit you and to kind of talk things through with you. And we're very happy to help anyone who is unsure and wants to form a cohort with other authorities. If you're not in discussions or you're not sure about whether your kind of neighbouring authorities are you know, are also interested in this, then certainly we would be very happy to help you with that. Yeah, hopefully that answers that question. Just seeing if we've got any more questions. Have we got any more questions? Has anybody else got any more questions that they want to ask? Yeah, I've got one here. Our revs and bends teams are generic. Are there any plans for a generic route, i.e. revs and bends? Something.
Well, the standard is absolutely been created for that in mind. We were very careful when we put the standard together not to exclude anybody. So yes, absolutely, you can go down. So when you go through the standard, you can have a mix of revs and bends type work. So it's really down to you as an employer as to what you want your apprentice to do. So yes, definitely.
Okay. Yeah, we've got one here. It says, will you be able to put local authorities in touch with each other if one cannot achieve a 10 learner cohort? Yes, certainly we can. I guess there are some authorities that might be considered neighbouring authorities who may not be in an actual region. So sometimes, yeah, so definitely, please get in touch. We'll be very happy to provide as much help as we can with that.
Neil, just going back to the question I've just answered, and that also might have been the question for you for Escalla, as to whether you are going to be doing a joint revs and bends training programme.
Yes, so I think we said earlier on about the learning plans. We've got one which is a revenues and benefits joint one, which is for new starters, and then we've got specific ones, one for revenues, and then we've got one just for benefits there for existing staff. We've got a question here with regards to the digital marketer standard and being grade 2 provider. Surely only those who meet that criteria will be on the register of approved training providers, or am I missing something?
Can I answer that?
Yeah, you can.
I think you may jump in here. No, you don't have to be a digital marketer standard at grade 2 to be on the register. But I think what you were referring to is that most local authorities in their preference for training providers have to be.
Yeah. That's sorry, I'm really sorry. I wasn't sure.
Is that right?
Yeah, and I was sorry, I wasn't sure. I was trying to read that question. I wasn't sure.
So, in order to be on the register of training providers, you don't have to be a digital marketer standard at grade 2, because there are a lot of really small organisations out there that will have applied to be on the register. So, no, that's not for that. I think you were saying that a lot of local authorities have got it included in their requirements.
Sorry, so just to clarify, what I was talking about was in your procurement, local authorities often have in their procurement policies that when they are looking for a training provider, they have to choose a training provider who is grade 2 or above. That's really what the point I was making. So and we definitely know that that's a fact, because we've been talking to customers who have told us that. Yeah, this one is there NDR training being prepared? So yes, in the revenues one we'll have a council tax pathway. We'll also have a business rates one, NDR. Yes, we've been asked a question about, is this webinar going to be available to share with others? Their learning and development team, for example. Yes, it is. So this is being recorded, and we will be making this recording available to everyone, with a list of all the questions and answers as well. So somebody's asked, when is this program likely to start? Will it be this September? Julie?
Well, if there's a standard, if the standard and the endpoint assessment and the funding band is all in place, then Escalla, I don't know, will you be providing this from September?
We hope so, honestly. I mean, we really thought we'd be able to provide this last September. And unfortunately, it didn't pan out like that, for all the reasons I think Julie talked about earlier on, about how difficult it was to go through this process and how challenging it was for the Trailblazer. But anyway, listen, that's all the questions that we've got time for now. So I just want to thank Julie, first of all, for speaking to us today. Thank you so much, Julie. Thank you for giving us your time.
Oh, thanks for the opportunity. Thank you.
It's our pleasure. I also want to thank you all for listening to us today, and for those of us who are able to stay to the end. As I've said earlier on, we are very happy to visit local authorities who have cohorts of 10 or more candidates who'd like to work, or if you'd like to work with neighbouring authorities to develop a cohort. So please let us know if this is something you're considering, and we're very happy to discuss this with you and give you assistance. Finally, please complete the feedback when you exit. It's really important to us that we know whether we got it right today, if there's any ways in which we can improve things for the future. As I've said earlier on, somebody asked a question. We will be emailing out a recording of this webinar together with our slides and a full list of the questions and answers from today's webinar. And finally, please do not forget to attend our next webinar, which is next week, Thursday the 10th of May, where we'll be looking at the rules and funding around the apprenticeship in more detail. So thank you very much, and goodbye.